Welcome to the Optimistic Curmudgeon, where the best ideas win. I'm your host, Josh Herring. Today, my guest is Dr. Scott Yenor. Dr. Yenor is a Washington Fellow at the Claremont Institute for the American Way of Life and a member of the National Association of Scholars. He is the author of The Recovery of Family Life, Exposing the Limits of Modern Ideology. Scott is a returning OC guest with episodes back in Season 3 and 4. Scott, welcome back to the Optimistic Curmudgeon.
Thanks for having me on. I appreciate it.
Love it each time we get together. I don't know very many folks who are just quite as forthright as you are, so it's always a good conversation.
Very good.
Well, today we're talking, of course, about your most recent co-written report. You wrote California's Blueprint for K-12 Education with Anna K. Miller. And I want to ask you kind of a two-part question to start us off. If you could first kind of summarize the report, that would maybe help our listeners know what we're talking about. But also, I did want to ask you, were you intending to grab me by the emotions as a reader of an educational report? Because I've never read one of these things before that I had to stop and put it down because I was getting viscerally angry. I didn't know if that was intentional or just an accidental byproduct, but there's where we'll start. Summary and then emotional engagement.
The truth is sometimes emotionally engaging. I suppose if all we could react to was the truth, we wouldn't need rhetoric. I think Aristotle said that. And we did try to, just describe California's system. So this report is part of a 2-report sequence. We did one on Florida's K through 12 education and another on California's, trying to take one from kind of each side of the spectrum politically, and then just describe the laws that California has. How does a teacher become certified? What are their parental choice options? How are school board elections conducted? How are state Department of Education policies arrived at? And then what kind of policies with respect to race and gender have been implemented within state standards generally? And so we just tried to describe the system. And the way I would describe California's system is kind of a closed system. And what I mean by that is the education establishment in California, has utter control over what is going on in the system. It's a union of the teachers' unions, the education bureaucrats, the interest groups that are interested in pushing identity politics curriculum, the legislature and the state superintendent or the state board of education are all on the same page, rowing in the same direction, and local school boards are really rowing in the same direction and are forced to row in the same direction. So California has a very professional system, and I mean that as an insult, in the sense that everyone who's involved in it is a professional educator who is taken with the contemporary vision of what woke education is and should be. So we just try to get into the weeds as to what would that mean. So in order to be certified as a teacher, well, you have to go through a state-approved college of education, and the state board dictates what is going to be taught there. It's a 5-year program. Nearly every teacher who is certified within California goes through such a school of education. And then nearly all of them join the union. Whereas some states have very low union percentage rates. California, it's not 100%, but there are as many union members as there are teachers. Obviously, some staff also join. So the union and the schools of education and the teachers are all kind of in the same direction. And that's what we really just try to describe when it came to the California system.
There's so much there. I think it's really interesting. I like that language of a closed system because it seems so counterintuitive that in the United States we've had this entrepreneurial spirit that has so characterized so many parts of American businesses, the American way of life. And when we look at education, there have been so many bright spots in the school choice movement of late. But then your report is really highlighting this whole state that is one of, if not the largest education systems in the country, that has just really locked itself away from any kind of innovation, any kind of change. But instead, and there's an ideal in play, and certainly somebody at the top of the system has said these are the goals that we are all going for. And in one sense, I think last time we talked, you gave me a lot of information about that word regime. There's a regime in play that is all moving in this one direction. But unfortunately, it seems like it's the wrong direction.
Yeah, I mean, in California, private schools are legal. And, about 10% of students, of kids of school age are in private schools. There are charter schools in California. I can't remember the exact percentage because I can't remember the total number of students in California, but it's about 500K students are in charter schools. So it's probably true that, somewhere in the neighborhood of 20% of California students are not in traditional education. However, private schools are regulated by the state. Charter schools are regulated by the state. Their teachers need to be certified. Their teachers can be members of unions. So the system actually also affects all of the private options there, and or at least can tend to affect the private options there. And it's more difficult to operate independent schools. That's what we mean by closed system. And many states, maybe I think it's 18 states, have no school choice options at this point. By which I mean, in all of them, private schools are legal, but they have no public support for any kind of education savings accounts or vouchers or anything like that. And the system is still in place, affecting the schools that both are and are not receiving public funds.
Let's talk a little bit about that 5-year training program and the way the teachers union comes in. Because I'm in my first semester as a college professor, and I can already see the effect that a college professor can have on students just by way of conversations and the way that assignments are shaped and the content of classes, even just in a single semester. What kinds of ideas are teachers being shaped by in those 5 years in their training programs?
Yeah, well, that's something that is yet to be done, I think. There hasn't really been an in-depth analysis of what goes on in schools of education around the country, what precisely the curriculum looks like. We know that it's powerful. We know that this is where the norms of the teaching profession are shaped. We know that it's ongoing because teachers are required to take ongoing training in order to keep their certification. So we know that it has a tremendous effect, and we see, there are certain fads that come through schools of education, and we see they percolate their way into K through 12 schools and into the way teachers handle themselves. So all of that, I think, is true. And then there's also kind of more global or broader trends. So things like multiculturalism, which was a norm back in the 1970s, really only introduced as a state standard and into state schools of education, in the mid to late 70s. It's now like the defining magnet toward which everything draws in schools of education. And you can see it in the research output. So, I'm punting on the question because I think it is actually something that is yet to be done to see precisely what goes on in a particular school of education. I'd love to have someone do that research under my direction someday.
Oh, well, I would love to read that. I'm currently leading a Department of Education, but a classical education department, and we exist in part to be sort of an alternative to mainstream education, because we do agree with the need for teachers. Obviously, that's apparent, but we think the good that can be done in a teacher training program is really giving students an accurate understanding of human nature, and then once you understand who the human person is, how that person learns, And then you need to get in the classroom, and you don't need to spend 5 years out of the classroom. You need to get in the classroom, get with real students, and learn how to teach by teaching. But that's really, at least here in North Carolina, that's certainly not the norm. That's not normally in North Carolina. Folks are they do most of their coursework. They do one semester of student teaching, and then they are they're really filled with a lot of wrong ideas about both teaching and about human nature through their teacher training preparation. I want to read for a moment from this is page 11 from your report. This page I just found was fascinating. I'm gonna hold it up to the screen in case anybody wants to be able to like actually zoom in. I can't imagine they will, but this one page just lists from 2011 to 2023 a series of laws that really bring in what your report calls critical social justice ideology into California education. In just a second, I'd love for you to tell us what you mean by critical social justice ideology. But I think it's helpful for our audience just to hear these different laws. 2011, we have Seth's Law that requires schools to adopt and publicize anti-bullying policies that include sexual orientation, gender identity, and or gender expression. In 2015, we have the Healthy Youth Act, which mandated LGBTQ plus inclusive, comprehensive sex education for grades 7 through 12. 2018, we have the online anti-bullying training for teachers and school staff that requires schools to provide teachers and staff with annual online training. Then we have in 2019, the Health Education Framework was passed. That framework includes training teachers to affirm and perhaps cultivate LGBTQ plus identities in students. This part really got me. According to the framework, kindergarten students learn about challenging gender stereotypes, gender identity, transgenderism, gender nonconforming. In 2021, we have the California Department of Education published the School Discipline Guidelines. These directed school districts to adopt restorative justice practices and more social emotional learning in the classroom. 2021, I'm not sure whether to laugh or to cry, but the Menstrual Equity for All Act requires public school service students in grades 6 through 12 to put feminine hygiene products in both men's and women's restrooms. In 2023, there's a piece I've been personally terrified and very concerned about was the Social Justice Mathematics Framework. And then, of course, in 2023, we also have the Task Force on Inclusive Education, a superintendent's task force to pressure curriculum providers to diversify their materials and be LGBTQ plus inclusive. I read those because it tells such a story over the last 12 years. And clearly there's been so much effort put into this. Scott, could you walk us through what exactly is critical social justice and how does it sort of work its way out in California education?
Yeah. And you just read a sample of the law today. We have written several articles just about this. I mean, it's an amazing focus, single-minded focus within the California system on what we call critical social justice policies. Now, I'm going to try to explain it like this. Critical social justice is a very broad ideology. It means that any disparities between racial groups or, ethnic groups or even sex groups are traceable to discrimination. And we take the word critical means that the people who are critical see through what is actually there and see that the reality is discrimination that explains the gaps. And then what do you do in order to remedy that? Well, you promote social justice, which is an environment which will eliminate the gaps. So critical social justice is just another way of saying our reigning civil rights ideology in America that manifests itself in a lot of different ways. When it comes to police, this leads people to want to abolish the police or to change standards of justice. And when it comes to universities, it means diversity, equity, and inclusion programs, and which are designed to eliminate gaps. You can apply it to almost any area or institution of life. It leads to affirmative action or racial preferences when it comes to admissions at school. When it comes to education systems, this broad critical social justice orientation leads to a bunch of curricular and administrative approaches to your job as a teacher. And we've tried to identify them. There are things like culturally responsive teaching, social emotional learning, particular approach to civics, and I think we're going to get to that. But all those things are doing is they're tools to deal with the gaps and to eliminate those gaps. Let me just use one example for this. And that gap is something that you just mentioned from a 2019 law or regulation in California, which is restorative justice. There are gaps between the suspension and expulsion and disciplinary rates between blacks and whites. So what do we do about those gaps? Well, we change the standards of behavior for blacks and whites so that it takes a lot more to become suspended, or it takes a lot more to be expelled, or we just ignore low-level disruptions in the class in order to have justice. That is the same percentage of blacks and the same percentage of whites suspended given their, presence in a school. So if the school is 40% black and 40% white, 40% of the suspensions will be blacks and 40% will be whites. That's restorative justice. Now, those programs have emanated out of the White House, out of schools of education. They've been demanded and implemented all over California. And it becomes more difficult to teach and keep order, but it's more just. At least that's according to the critical social justice ideology. So how do you deal with disparities? That's critical social justice. Restorative justice is how you do it in discipline in the school.
On one hand, I can see where that makes sense, where somebody can look at a pie chart and say, wow, it sure seems like we don't have a proper distribution here. But at the same time, I'm thinking of I spent 2 years in a role that did involve having to deal with disciplining children in a school. And sometimes I was investigating incidents. Sometimes I was on a team investigating different incidences. And I hear that and think it would be poisonous to my thought process when I'm trying to figure out who actually did something to then think about to bring in race as a factor in that. And it seems incredibly unjust to me. I think it is unjust to then have a certain set of expectations for one racial group that are different from another racial group based on the number of people of that race that are present in a school. It seems far more
or you could have the same expectations, like without a dead body, there's no reason to discipline someone. And that's kind of the tendency of these policies. I mean, we could criticize these policies. Obviously, no one cares about the disparity between men and women or boys and girls when it comes to discipline in school. We're about 90% of the students who are suspended are boys, 10% are girls. It differs according to years and different areas, but that's basically the number. And no one cares about that disparity. And I just want you to know, I don't care about that disparity either. I think that reflects the amount of rambunctiousness in one or the other. But it's an inconsistently applied principle, obviously.
Sure. I mean, I think that it's just poisonous to the atmosphere of a school. I mean, at the point where you have that much disruption happening, I imagine there's a sharp decline in learning that would be reflected in the actual end of your data. I want to get to that here in a second. I do wonder if you could you tell us a little bit more about, you alluded to it earlier, the action civics. What is the goal of action civics?
Yeah, the old idea of civics is that you would learn a lot about your country's government and history, and therefore be a civically minded person ready to vote and informed. The new idea of action civics, or what is also called service learning, is that students will be prepared to protest and call out the government or whatever institution that they are a part of or viewing for violations of the ethic of critical social justice. So emphasizing activism divorced from knowledge.
Mm. Well, that seems to go hand in hand with the emphasis on equity in the contemporary curriculum.
Yeah, an emphasis on equity is simply changing standards to achieve equal group outcomes. And so abolishing the use of the SAT or the ACT in college admissions or grade point averages in college admissions is done in the name of equity. Or I think as recently happened here in Florida, one of the community colleges had an engineering or pre-engineering degree, and they dropped the requirement that you had to have certain levels of math in order to get into engineering programs because that requirement had disparate impact when it came to the races.
So we're looking at a whole system of thought that is looking at differences in groups of people, and based on these numerical differences, then insisting that we have to change reality to better give us a different outcome.
Well, it's not changing reality. It's changing this, as they would see it, changing the system that has produced these inequalities. So if the standards have some disparate impact, there's something wrong with the standard that needs to be manipulated or changed so that it can have an equal impact and achieve social justice. I mean, that's from within that ideology, that's what's going on. And that's the governing ideology in the California K-12 system. I'm sure it's the governing ideology in other parts of the California system, but certainly in the K-12 system.
It is astounding to me how the left in this case for the leftists in education have done an amazing job in coming up with really positive sounding terms for all of these. I mean, none of these things that you're describing, action civics sounds like what I would want an imaginary child of mine to be studying. I want him to be actively learning, and civics matters. So I could hear that as a parent and think, oh yeah, that's great. Now I would, if somebody said, hey, do you want your kid to grow up to be an activist? I would suddenly be like, no, that's not what I'm looking for. But with the right terminology, it sounds like so much of this could fly right over the surface of even moderately attentive parents. Is that fair, or are parents kind of aware of the doublespeak that's happening here?
Well, I don't know if they're aware of the doublespeak. The report really tries to lay it out. I mean, I agree. Doesn't action civics sound good? Doesn't, just to use another example, doesn't whole child education sound like a good thing? I mean, are you in favor of educating a part of the child? And if so, which part? And so, and this is actually right out of Catholic social teaching. We teach the whole person, which means the soul and the mind and the body. But whole child education means that you're not holding children to standards of knowledge that the teacher represents and imparts, but rather you're teaching students to follow their inner and properly molded affections and become leaders of the classroom themselves so that they can recognize when teachers represent biased standards or don't use the proper pronouns or whatever. And so, yes, I mean, there's a big shell game when it comes to the language. It's difficult for me to say things like this because I do believe that it is the job of elites in a country to mine the inheritance and to pass it on to the next generation. But one just has to be suspicious of every word now that comes out of an education elite because they have used the goodwill that people have toward elites and education institutions generally in order to ship in a lot of very questionable ideological content.
Well, let's get into some of the specific ways that gets worked in. As I was reading the report, there were 4 places that particularly leapt out at me. That it seems like these are the places that parents might hear one word, but they really should know there's more going on. So I thought it might work well if I'll sort of play the role of the parent. I'd like you to enlighten me about what's really going on here. So I might hear that my school has this new mathematics framework, and I'm thinking, oh, that's exciting. I want my kid to learn math, and I want him to learn the latest math and the up-to-date math. We've got Stanford University in our state. Surely there's some new mathematical theories that have been developed that maybe we've updated Euclid a bit, but I really want my kid to be strong in algebra and calculus and be ready to maybe even defeat China in a coming tech race because we've got top-notch mathematicians in the state of California. Is that what's going on in the new math framework?
Well, the new math framework isn't like in my biggest alley, so I'm just gonna just say a couple things about this. That the new math framework is going to emphasize social justice and process, not outcomes. So, like the idea that there's a right answer to your math problem is imposing a standard from society on the student's own ability to follow his own culture, and therefore not marking things wrong will end up being an important part of the new mathematical framework. Therefore, you can get actual, like, racially balanced answers. As I say, it's not like my ballywick. I'm much more in the sex and gender area than I am in the math. But that's the element of the math framework that has been handed down.
Have no fear. We're heading there next. But before we get there, I just want to read one bit from page 12. California has adopted a new mathematics framework for all K-12 schools and declared that, quote, teaching towards social justice can play an important role in shifting students' perspectives. These ideological math standards presuppose that teaching math plainly and objectively reinforces oppressive power structures, and therefore must be transformed through politicized pedagogical practices to make math about social justice and equity. Reviewers of the new math framework have found that it contains many misrepresentations of the literature it cites, selectively cites research to make points it wants to make, and will put California students years behind the students in other nations in the developed world. That last part just kind of, I thought was very interesting because you have mathematics and education professors who are literally misrepresenting the information that they're using to justify these changes and tell teachers that they should not mark students wrong and should use culturally sensitive word problems and so on. And they're literally going to harm the exact students that they're claiming to help.
Yeah, I mean, math is one of the areas that we can pretty easily test people in and find out how they're doing. And California is like, I mean, America itself doesn't do great when it comes to math stuff. About 30% of California's 8th graders are proficient in math.
Could you say that number again? Was that 30%?
30% where public schools are proficient in math. And I mean, it's not the lowest ranked state when it comes to that. It's about 29th, 30th, depending on the year that you use the test. So, I mean, we have a big problem regardless. And then putting, the brakes of social justice ideology on it makes it even more difficult to reflect reality.
I think I've been talking to a lot of friends who are working on either teaching math in a classical school or want to develop a particular classical approach to teaching math. And it seems that part of what we've lost is a foundational view that math is actually real. And if we could get back to teaching students that math is real, these relationships are real, and we are learning to better describe reality through mathematical analysis, that would give us a much better grasp on the truths that math can help us learn. But moving in this social justice direction is not the way to go. Well, Scott, how about sex education standards? I can imagine a parent who would think, it's probably good that my kid has to take a health class that's going to teach him about biology and warn him that if he messes around, he might get some infections. What's going on with sex education standards in California these days?
Yeah, I mean, sex education hasn't been that for years. A boomer. That was a boomer question, kind of. So, um,
You're a little bit older than I am, so if you're gonna go, hey boomer to me, I'm just gonna point that out. But that was fair. That was fair.
I mean, the purpose of sex education standards is teach what they call comprehensive sex education, which once again, that doesn't necessarily sound bad. Like you want to learn to integrate sex into your whole life. And as I like to say, find a subordinate place for sex in your life. And it should be subordinate to other goods. It's not the highest good. But what comprehensive sex education really means is celebration of diversity when it comes to sexual expression, and the view that any lack of celebrating diversity is ipso facto intolerance and causes harm on those who want to practice diversity. So that is the goal of California's sex education standards, comprehensive sex education like that.
So just to make sure I'm tracking this, then, at a time when the state of California has 30% of its students who can pass the end-of-year math test, they're putting a whole lot of emphasis on this comprehensive sex education idea.
Oh, yeah. I mean, the 21 woke acts relating to gender ideology and racialist ideology that have been passed since 2011, of which you gave a sample before, are really the beating heart of the California education system. That's where the money's being spent. That's where the innovation is happening, and not in those traditional kind of stodgy old disciplines like mathematics.
Now, what also struck me as interesting in the report was the focus on this happening in grades 7 through 12. And the description here is really interesting. The law permits such education in elementary schools. Instruction at each grade level must affirm different sexual orientations and be inclusive of same-sex relationships in discussions and examples, and it must involve lessons about gender identity and gender expression in elementary school. So that's going as low down as does that include pre-K, or is that started
all the way to kindergarten?
Okay.
They are establishing universal pre-K. I mean, it's hard to begin to ferret out or differentiate all of these things, but just to say this, that in order for people to learn to celebrate diversity, they need to learn to celebrate it early. So we're going to take advantage of all the opportunities we have to celebrate it in kindergarten. So the reading, insofar as reading goes on, will have books that recognize gender fluidity. And these are the things that have caused controversies all around the country when it comes to what books should be included in school libraries. The controversies kind of exist in California, but the governing authorities are really on the side of promoting it. And it's part of the comprehensive sex education standards that the State Department of Education has passed. So yeah, it goes all the way down because, look, I mean, otherwise students are going to be educated in this intolerant system where they're transphobic or homophobic or misogynistic or racist. So it has to start as early as possible because the system is producing gaps.
Now, let's take a look at one other area where those gaps exist. The ethnic studies curriculum is something I've been following for a couple of years. I read through a couple of sections when it was in kind of a public beta test. That too seemed to be a way that all of these ideas were going to be pumped in. Now, I've been to California a couple times. It does have a lot of different people from different parts of the world all living together. So again, it's not hard to imagine a parent thinking, yeah, it's probably a good thing for my kid to understand this person comes from this part of the world and is likely to have this set of values and so on. Is that what's happening in an ethics studies framework, or is something different happening?
No, that is not happening in the ethnic studies framework. I mean, the way I would think about this is that the acceptable way to one should try to understand different cultures. Like I'm sure, like you, I'm very interested in ancient Sparta, ancient Athens, ancient Rome. They are political communities that are nothing like ours. I actually am interested in studying what the Code of Hammurabi is. Like it's interesting. And similarly, like I'm happy to learn about, the ancient Ming Dynasty. Like it doesn't have to be Western. I'm interested in learning these things. But why am I interested in learning these things? Because this diversity of cultures that we can encounter gives rise to the philosophic insight of, well, which one's right? How is it done better? And which one is true? And without the different kinds of political communities, you never get the spark to ask who's right. And if that's what multiculturalism was, then I guess I'd be for it. But what ethnic studies is a different understanding of multiculturalism, which is that every culture or subculture or ethnic group or racial group has their own standards, and it's never right for a dominant group to impose its standards on the other group. So whites practice the nuclear family and believe in the Christian God, let us say. And Muslims who come into the country don't believe in the Christian God and might practice, I'm just using this to illustrate, polygamy. Well, they need their laws. We should celebrate their ways. And since Christian nuclear family place is the dominant culture, we don't celebrate that culture. So this would lead students to learn a lot about Muslim holidays and never learn anything about a Christian holiday. They would teach students about the importance of family diversity and recognizing it, and never teach students the normative value of the nuclear family. And so that's kind of where the ethnic studies standards point. They point to, I guess, what that is called as culturally responsive teaching. Doesn't that sound like a good thing? We want to be culturally responsive, but like that's just another one of these word games. Culturally responsive teaching means that there's no standard from the dominant culture, so-called, that can be imposed on or, imposed on a non-dominant minority culture.
So even as you're describing that, two moments from history come to my mind are of where that has that kind of dominant culture and position has happened in an incredibly positive way. I love asking students to read Cortez's description of Tenochtitlan and under the Aztecs, and he's got this great description of an idol that is made of the literal hearts that have been removed from sacrificial victims. And it's a lovely, or not very lovely, it's a gross, visceral moment to ask students to really think through. We just read 5 pages about this amazing marketplace that Cortez had to walk through and all the trade that's happening. But all of that is premised on a human sacrifice system that's sitting at the core of their society. And of course, why are you shocked that a Catholic Spaniard who arrived in the middle of that was like, nope, we are not dealing with this. Like, we're not talking about this. We are stopping this right here, right now. There's no discussion. Second example that comes up every now and again was I just find this so fascinating. When Utah applied to join the Union, the Congress insisted on 2 things. They were very concerned about the Mormons possibly taking over the United States. So they said, you can join if we can put an army base right outside of Salt Lake City. But the other thing they insisted on was that the Mormons could not practice polygamy and be full members of the Union. And so lo and behold, the Mormons decided to they were okay with both of those things. And of course, the Mormons have had issues with fundamentalists who disagree with the polygamy rule ever since. But that still was a recognition that if you're going to join this wider community of the United States, you do have to agree on some basic fundamental things for our culture. So I think there's something very really pernicious about asking students who have, in a best case scenario, students who really do want to learn and are curious, but asking them to learn that differences don't matter. And it's asking students to squash their natural impulse towards drawing a conclusion with an eye towards their conscience and the natural law that's written on their hearts. So I don't know. It's just sad in a lot of ways.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if that means that the California system is unnatural. The whole multicultural enterprise, tends in this direction. It's available in every state. It's just that California has expanded the scope and eliminated alternatives to this vision, I think, more effectively than other states.
Well, let's talk about that for just a moment then, because one thing I want to get your thoughts on, and is it so I guess one of the questions I'm always looking for on the show is for guests to kind of turn towards the question of hope. And so I guess is there a silent majority was Ronald Reagan's silent majority still there in California that could take over school boards and change the system from within and really kind of work to make evident that these values are not in alignment with parents, the typical California parent, or is this just reflective of there's so much control that resistance is impossible, and the best answer is to leave and go somewhere like Florida, like North Carolina, like other states that have said, yeah, we're doing other things. We might have some of this, but not to that extent.
Yeah, we catalog how some school districts have tried to, I'll say, push back or defy state mandates when it comes to like obscene books in the library or boys using girls' bathrooms, and how the state has come down on those local school districts like a ton of bricks. And they hold a lot of purse strings. It's usually the more poor school districts that do that. And so they have a difficult time really maintaining any kind of independence. It's also true that about 2/3 of the school board members that are endorsed by the California teachers unions win school board seats. So gaining a majority is difficult. It's kind of an inside job of serving on a school district. Often it's spouses of teachers or teachers themselves who are sitting on it. And so I'm not saying that I'm ready to abandon hope, all ye who enter. But there isn't a lot within California's system to which one can appeal in order to leverage a change in how California does things. In Florida, for instance, this is the contrast that we try to set out doing in the two reports. In Florida, there's a lot of different ways to be certified as a teacher. In Florida, they have broader standards that you can appeal to, and even some classical standards that you can appeal to in English language, in math. They don't have as many of those in California, and so it's difficult to find places within that you could say, all right, let's build this up, and let's try to from this standard try to expand the influence that we might have. And so at one point in the conclusion, I was trying to give people hope. And I said, look, there's two kinds of systems. And I borrowed this from Machiavelli.
I like your allusion to an Italian philosopher. I was like, I'll bet I know who that is. And I was excited. I was right. It was Machiavelli.
And it's from chapter 5 of The Prince, where Machiavelli says, well, there's two kinds of systems. There's the French and the Turkish system. The Turkish system is very difficult to get into, but if you do get into it, you can destroy it. And the French system is very easy to get into, and the very ease to get into it makes it difficult to destroy. And here's what he means. The Turkish system is a hierarchical system where everyone owes their existence to the Sultan. And there are satraps underneath him, and it's very difficult to turn any of them. But someday If you just take off the head of the Sultan, he's protected, he's difficult to get access to. But if you can do that, you can change the whole thing. That's a closed system.
Mm.
In California, I would say is like the Turkish system. The French system is there's a king, but there's all these independent nobles with their own states. And you can find one discontented noble to align with, and maybe two discontented nobles to align with. You can always find someone who thinks the king's not doing a good job and that they should be king. But the problem is everyone else owes like a little bit of fealty to the king. And so getting enough people to want to overturn the king is very difficult. So it's easy to find discontented people, but it's difficult to overturn the system. It needs to turn gradually in a different direction. And that's kind of what usually happens in French-type systems. So there's an ossification that happens in the Turkish system, but still difficult to overthrow. Whereas in the French system, and this is what I would liken Florida to, there are a lot of oppositional elements within the system that you can actually find allies, and you can actually build things and reform things in areas or in slivers or slices or cross sections of the education system. And it's just that you look at California and it's kind of hopeless, and you say all you have to do is kill the Sultan, and which is a big job, but like once you do it, you might be able to get somewhere.
Oh, from what you've said, though, the difficulty is that I want to immediately liken the Sultan to Gavin Newsom, but just in case anyone wants to take this wildly out of context, let it be clear, I am not in any way saying anyone should go kill Gavin Newsom. That's not the line. But the difficulty is that it's not just Gavin Newsom. He's the current head of this system, but you had a line that I pulled out about there's an alliance between government bureaucrats, tech oligarchs, and the underserved in California's bloated system. It's this whole composite picture put together that's a mix of ideology and bureaucracy. So it's sort of I don't see how it would take a long, slow slog to change that system. There's not a single figurehead, I guess is what I'm saying.
Yes, no, that's true. And that's what I mean by calling it a closed system
Okay.
as opposed to an open one. And so I agree with that. I mean, and that means that the Sultan isn't a person; it's an ideology, and that ideological change would have to be imposed from the outside. And look, I can imagine that happening. It's just identifying what that ideological change of competence and professionalism would be that would have to be emphasized. Maybe it would be a more aristocratic education where we try to identify the best and teach them in competence and teach all the others toward decent family life and good jobs and civic mindedness. But regardless, I mean, some alternative has to be identified in order for the Sultan ideology to be replaced.
I think it'll be very interesting to look back at the early 2020s, 20, maybe 30 years from now, and see if we can. I'll be very curious if there's demographic evidence of this, because I keep meeting people who have moved to North Carolina from California, and I'm very curious if the answer. We had a visitor a couple of weeks ago who was he was in North Carolina he was interviewing for jobs in the area, and he really was just very concerned about the educational landscape for his children. And he didn't see an avenue to change that would be effective before his kids were in, say, middle school. So his answer to that was like, all right, I need to find a job that will meet my family's needs, and it's going to be somewhere where I can put my kids in for a good education. And I'll be really curious if that's normal over the next decade.
We have some numbers on this in the report, and I can't recall precisely what the numbers are off the top of my head, but the number of students who are in the California, number of people of student age in California has declined, and not just demographically, but like it's declined absolutely, and out of kilter with the demographic decline that is coming up. And obviously in Idaho, we have tons of people who've moved from California, many people of school age. This has happened in Arizona. This has happened in Nevada. They've lost 2 congressional seats over the course of time. Its population has shrunk. This is part of it. It's middle-class people leaving California, both because they're priced out of markets, but also because of vaccine mandates that preceded COVID, and then the emphasis in their education system, and now the transgender refuge bill, I think, is also encouraged some people to relocate.
I cannot imagine being a parent looking at that bill and thinking, okay, if my kid buys into this lunacy and then says I'm X and I say no, you're Y, the state will take my kids, and I would be moving so fast. That's crazy.
We'll see. Yes, but it's been happening. It's been happening since 2011, when the entire stream of 21 laws on this has been passed.
Well, Scott, as we're kind of wrapping up to a close, I've got a couple last questions for you. The piece that really, I know we've talked about this a little bit, but the openness of what the left has been trying to do just staggers me. I mean, this is not hidden. Maybe it was a little more subtle 20 years ago, but now it's so blatant. I mean, you can look at these 21 laws, you can look at each of these educational frameworks or sets of standards had to go through a public review period where parents could comment, teachers could see what was coming. So I'm curious about this though. Do you see any lessons that the right could take from the overt way the left is seeking its goals? And I know these are vast abstractions, but there just seems like something that's very straightforward. The left has said, we want these 3 things, and we're going to bend every institution to that goal. Is there something that the political right can learn from that?
Yeah, and I think the political right has responded to the left by saying, we'd like to be able to opt out of the goals that you're setting, and that school choice or the protection of homeschooling is the conservative policy, but they're opt-outs. They are policies that say, you can keep the system, we just want permission and maybe support for leaving the system and pursuing our own thing. And the thing I think that conservatives have to learn from the left is that all education is political in the sense that it promotes a particular vision of the good, beautiful, and just, in the sense that it shapes citizens. And so opting out is never enough, that you have to actually undertake the more difficult job of reconquering, reconstituting the institutions that you are seeking to leave. So I'm not opposed in principle to homeschooling. I'm pro these things, but they're not sufficient end goals for a movement that wants to actually affect the future of the country. The left has grabbed the education system and have bent it in the direction explicitly that they have said they would. And the fruit of that is now easy to see on the tree. And only a similar, cultivation on the right is an adequate response. And I still don't see tons of evidence that people are aware of this problem. We say things like education, not indoctrination, which, maybe properly understood, that's a good slogan. We try to deny that education is, in the deepest sense, political. It's not partisan necessarily, but it is political in the deepest sense of reflecting a kind of understanding of the true, advantageous, and just. And we try to say that we're trying to teach students not what to think, but how to think. Or at least trying to teach them about what to think about, which is part of how is. And so, yeah, it's. I think that's the big lesson, is that you can't avoid justice.
I think that's a great way to phrase it. I know we've gone at Thales, we've gone back and forth over the years about some of those slogans. We've used at times we teach students how to think, not what to think. And I've always found that to be a vacuous statement, because if that were really true, I don't know how we can explain giving tests, because I am trying to measure how much of the material I taught my students have managed to remember to tell back to me on the test. And when I mark them wrong, I am literally correcting what they have not thought correctly. And that's of course not the people want to say we are not trying to practice like brainwashing, but that's not what we actually communicate to students. We communicate to students that we don't really think that the matter of our education actually is significant. And that's simply false. Get any three teachers in a room together, and you will have three diehard people committed to their vision of what a curriculum is supposed to be. And every teacher's got those opinions. That matters quite a bit. Scott, any last thoughts on that question?
Yeah, I mean, just to say, like, the word curriculum means course, right? And it's the course of education, and there's always a destination. Like, conservatives have just tried to say, well, let everyone choose, and that's their way of getting out of the ideological trap. And once again, like, I'm not against those policies, but let's just recognize that means we're abandoning the public institutions. And that means that the left is going to be defining the true, the advantageous, and the just for the political community. Thank you very much.
That's a terrifying future. Well, Scott, what's next in your pipeline? Do you have other writing projects you're working on, or are there other things that you have you're able to tell us about? What's coming up next for you?
Yeah, I mean, we're Anna Miller and I are doing a comparison of Florida and California, just so that it's easy to see how they're different. And then, I'm hoping to actually change direction a little bit and get out of the business of diagnostic and into the business of prognostic, that is trying to give a vision for what a conservative or an American public school would look like. I think we've lost an account of that, and trying to do the same thing when it comes to higher ed. Conservatives have spent a lot of time writing white papers about opting out, and not a lot of time thinking through what they would want to accomplish with public institutions. And so I'm planning on doing some of that stuff in the near future.
Well, that's exciting. I'm a long-term descendant of a product of public education. My grandfather was both of my grandparents were public teachers, and my mom grew up both of my parents went through public school, but they decided to homeschool me and my brothers. But at my grandpa's funeral a couple years ago, I was kind of struck by the fact that we really have been shaped by their work in education in a very real way. But public education has changed so much in the last 80 years that I don't know if my grandparents would be wanting to go into it today the way that they were when they did. So there is so much value in those public institutions if they can be salvaged to be institutions that are leaning towards truth, goodness, and beauty, and justice. Now, to go back to maybe our conversation at the top of the episode about as you were describing the critical social justice movement, I was thinking about that term gets so much discussion in Plato's Republic, and he comes around at the end to talking about justice is the right arrangement of all the parts of the person, and perhaps by analogy, the right arrangement of all the elements of the polis and beyond that the country. And if we could get back to that right arrangement and an agreement on the meaning of that vision, that would be a healthy move for the United States for sure.
Amen.
Well, Scott, where can people find and follow your work online if they want to know more about what you're doing?
Oh, I mean, I write in a variety of websites. I usually post my stuff onto my Twitter feed, but I am not active on Twitter. I am not good on Twitter. I don't try to be good, but that's one place that I posted. It's at Scott Yenor, if you want to be notified when I publish something.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Scott, for coming on the show today. This has been really fun, and I'm glad you and Anna have done the work to help the rest of us just kind of piece this story together and see what's going on in Californian education today.
Well, thanks for having me on.
Thank you, listeners, for joining us for another episode of The Optimistic Curmudgeon. My guest this episode has been Dr. Scott Yenor, Senior Director of State Coalitions at the Claremont Institute Center for the American Way of Life. If you like this episode, please leave us a 5-star review and share it with your friends. Until next time, seek the good, discover the true, and love the beautiful.